about pine health issues in the southeastern US. If that's not why you're here, I'm sorry, but if you just stick it through anyway, you'll still get that CFE. So let's first start with a disclaimer. If you've seen me speak, you know I say this fairly commonly. You're going to get a lot of information based on facts and science, but you'll also get some opinions, especially because we're going to talk a little bit about the D word today, decline. And I've got some opinions on that. Those opinions, of course, are based on the science. So I want to take a step back first and start with what is forest health, because we get this question a lot. What is forest health? And it depends on your objective, right? Because there's a lot of different objectives we have for owning forest land or for managing forest land. It could be just your objective is strictly products. You want loads of logs, pole timber. That is one objective. Hunting and fishing is another objective. Having it for firewood is an objective. Just having that land as an investment or something to pass on to your heirs, your kids, your grandkids. There's also just having land for recreation, somewhere to walk around, ride your bikes. These are all reasons to have that land, just something to preserve for nature, to watch the birds and the bees and all that good stuff. And, you know, more commonly, we're seeing a lot of non-timber products, you know, and even some food as you get into some areas. Pine straw is a big one we have with a lot of pine land down here. The whole point of me telling you this is that forest health means something without people. Like without people, forests are going to do what forests are going to do. Trees are going to grow, they're going to die, they're going to get recycled. And that's just a process that happens without management. But when we have, you know, this whole forest health issue, forest health takes on a new meaning when the sustainability of that forest is challenged by our human desires or objectives, right? So what we want out of that forest really impacts our perception of how healthy it is. Assuming most folks here are somewhat affiliated with production forestry, we production forester folks generally want all of those trees to be alive because every live tree represents you know, income, right? It's going to go on that truck, it's going to produce that pine straw. All of this stuff, you know, notwithstanding, we need to understand that trees die, right? And sometimes trees die from concrete events. This is some trees that are clearly going to die from Hurricane Matthew a few years ago, back down in, this was taken in Statesboro. Trees die from insects. This is a large southern pine beetle infestation, a fairly famous photo in forest entomology in the Southeast, taken in Texas, you know, what is that, almost 30 years ago now. And sometimes, so, you know, the two pictures I just showed you, we know what killed those trees. The wind blew it over, the beetle killed it. In some cases, you don't really know why trees die. And this was one on the side of the road where my in-laws used to live over on the north side of Atlanta. This is a large pine tree that just up and died. Why did it die? Who knows, right? But when we think about trees and them dying, I always come back to this Manion's decline spiral. Paul Manion was a forest pathologist that lived a few years ago, and he created this decline snail, this decline spiral, as it were. What it has is 3 different rings to it with different types of factors that influence tree health. Okay, we're going to go through them here. On the outside ring, things we call predisposing factors. These are factors that by themselves don't, you know, specifically kill a tree, but they serve to chronically weaken the thing. The next ring of the snail is our inciting factors. And these are things that might be more of a one-time or 2 or 3 times more concrete events, but also concrete events that probably don't directly kill that tree, but they're going to weaken it quite a bit, right? And then in the middle, the final little rung there, contributing factors. This is what people often notice. This is the canker fungi. This is the Ips bark beetles. This is the root rot and butt rot. This is what a lot of people notice. And the important thing here is by the time these things have come, the damage has already been done. These are the last to the dinner table. They're the last to the buffet line. They're just coming to a weak tree. So when we look at these predisposing factors, again, these are chronic factors. By themselves, they don't necessarily or noticeably harm a tree. I'm talking about things like the genetics of that tree, right? Soils and different soil characteristics, the compaction, the texture, you know, these are clay pan, all that type of thing. If a tree is planted outside its comfort zone, we often say put the right tree on the right site. We'll talk a little more about that. And old age is a predisposing factor. Trees die, right? Everything gets old and dies. And at some point when things get old, they're going to get weak. And when they get weak is when you get a lot of these other things in there. So trees are just one of those things. Inciting factors are these factors that harm but don't kill a tree, but they're more acute. So they take place in a more concrete time frame. And I'm talking about drought. There can be a really big bad drought event that has ripple effects, for many years. Or maybe a defoliation occurs where all of a sudden in the middle of the summer that tree is stripped of its needles, of all its foliage. That's a big stressor for that tree, and it's got to refoliate. It's probably going to refoliate, but it doesn't mean it's going to be as healthy as it was before because it lost a whole bunch of reserves and nutrition. Excuse me. Physical damage, we see this very often in times of construction, especially with some of those pine trees in more urban areas. And then also weather, things like a late frost or a flood, that type of thing. That's probably not going to kill a tree, but it's certainly going to set it back a little bit. And finally, we have those contributing factors. These are those things that contribute to that tree's death, but they wouldn't be there if that tree wasn't already on the way out. So if anyone says, Ips bark beetles are the reason my pine tree died, well, they're one of the reasons, but that tree is not going to have Ips bark beetles if the tree's healthy in the first place, right? And it goes that way for a lot of these other things. And again, this is most insects and most fungi are contributing. When it comes to pine, we've got a couple that don't fit this. Southern pine beetle, that is not a contributing factor. That is a primary tree killer, right? That's why we have so much effort towards it. Regeneration weevils, if they're feeding on the phloem, the outer bark of those newly planted seedlings, they will directly kill those seedlings. They are not contributing to death, they are causing death. So just a couple, asterisks there. But in general, pine health overall, it's influenced and driven by all these things. None of these things work in a vacuum. None of it operates in a vacuum. It all sort of fits together. So we'll talk about some of these predisposing factors, right? And so right now we've got, this is what a lot of, we hope a lot of forest land looks like now. We've got some of these nice longleaf stands. You got some wiregrass under there. It looks great. But decades ago, a lot of what is now forest in the Southeast was agriculture. And agriculture is particularly hard on the soil. It breaks it down. It destroys the structure, sucks a lot of nutrients out. A lot of chemicals get put in. Most of the forest land in the Southeast is on former agricultural land. And that land, think of it as you're already starting without a full deck, right? You've already got some poor soil these trees are trying to grow on. Right tree, right site. If you look on this slide, you see there's an outline there, a dark outline. That's the historical range of longleaf pine. Longleaf, you will probably not be shocked to know, does not grow in every place there anymore. It's more concentrated in some of those circles. So it's one of these things where longleaf used to be there. It was harvested. Loblolly was planted there. It grows a little bit faster, and people, for a long time thought, well, wow, it'd be better to put loblolly there. It can grow anywhere, right? And yes, loblolly can grow anywhere. And I like to use this example. This is a guy that has a fish tank hat, right? So he's got his whole face encased in this fish tank, and there's fish in there and there's water, and he's breathing from a tube. And this to me is akin to putting loblolly everywhere. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Longleaf is much better on some of these deep sandy soils than is loblolly. So I think the tide is changing, but this is kind of that type of example here. Commercial forestry and intensive management, there's been a lot of effort, and we've made a lot of great strides forward in making more productive trees, right? We have increased our tree productivity immensely in the last few decades. But at what cost, one could argue, right? Because a lot of times you don't get the insect and pest resistant stuff doesn't really come into play. They're looking at how fast can the trees grow, what's their form, and a lot of times you just don't see the interest or the effort towards insect and disease resistance. And then management is an absolutely huge one, right? Management is 90% of the stuff most of us land owners, especially as extension folks, deal with is management issues. Competition control, you have to control competition. These trees are a crop if you want them to grow in that manner. You've got to control that. This is a good example of an area we got called to a few years ago. They said, well, I have pine decline. And we went out here and they hadn't done any competition control. They had hardwoods in there just as big as the pine trees. That's not pine decline. That's just the circle of life happening, right? This is just hardwoods out competing those pine trees. You know, another management activity is thinning. If you're trying to grow crop trees, crop pine trees, you have got to manage that basal area, because if you don't, they will start competing with each other. This is just the natural circle of life, right? This stand is not thin, 17 years old, and you can see that these things are still on 4-foot spacing, and there's a huge variation because some trees are just starting to win the battle for sunlight and for nutrients. And then neglect. You know, this is not often something that is done on purpose. A lot of times this is what happens when, you know, entities or people come into land that wasn't owned by them beforehand. If it's been neglected, it's often, it can be really hard to come back from a high level of neglect. And then fire, a lack of fire. You know, most southern pine systems in the southeastern US, they're adapted to fire, you know, especially longleaf and shortleaf. You know, fire provides a crucial role. It's gotten a bit of a bad name by some of the environmental groups. Fire definitely has a purpose, especially if it's done well. And if you don't do that fire, like you see here, you're going to have all sorts of competition, and that competition is going to stress those trees. It's going to fight for water, going to fight for nutrients. And so this, you know, not doing that fire to me is a predisposing factor because you're weakening things. Now, that said, fire can also be an inciting factor. If the fire gets too hot, you're going to have some, you know, that's an acute thing that happens, and you're going to have some weak trees. You might lose some trees. That's a lot of times when we get some of the turpentine beetles in there. What we're after, though, is, you know, as many of you know, a nice fire that creeps through, gets rid of that stuff on the understory, and takes care of all our objectives here. Drought is an inciting factor, you know, and now some might argue that this is also a predisposing factor. It really gets down to how long and how severe is that drought. Is it just a little dry for 10 years in a row, or is it super dry for 1 year? I think we saw that in what was it, 2016, 2017, when there was those big fires in Gatlinburg. It was a crazy drought year that year. I know in the Carolinas and Georgia, we had lots of IPS spots as a result, everything getting getting stressed from that drought. This is, you know, this is a thing we look at. And if you're not familiar with the drought monitor, I highly recommend it because it gives a good snapshot. You go on this website, droughtmonitor.unl.edu. You can click into, you know, the region, the state, and really get a feel for what is happening. As you can see in this image, we're doing pretty good overall in the Southeast right now. There's a few dry spots in the Western Gulf and, you know, the Piedmont there in Florida, but overall, Southeast is doing pretty well. And then one of the other inciting factors is defoliation. And for pines, we're basically looking at sawflies, right? There's a lot of different, several different sawfly species. Most of these are Neodiprion. They are the most impactful defoliators we have in pines. All pines are susceptible to them. The damage is usually pretty spotty. You can have outbreaks and larger infestations. You often see more damage in the single species plantations and on those younger trees. And then, like any defoliation, it's probably not going to kill that pine tree, but if it happens over and over and over again, it starts to degrade and deplete the resources that tree has, you know, in its root system. The red-headed pine sawfly is probably the most common sawfly we have here in the Southeast. There's also a black-headed pine sawfly and a loblolly pine sawfly. They look a little different. Functionally, they all do basically the same thing, right? And that is consume those needles. And one thing to look at with these pine sawflies, now remember, these are like caterpillars, but they're not caterpillars. They're a little tiny wasp, stingless wasp, but they often feed together. And what you will see is a combination of damage on any one area. You'll usually see these little sort of brown half needles sticking up. This is damage from the young larvae because their mandibles, their little jaws, are not large enough to eat the whole needle. So what they do is eat that needle kind of like an ear of corn. They're gnawing on it and kind of eating half of it, and the rest of it just sits there sort of dead and brownish. As those larvae get larger, their mandibles get larger, and then they eat the needle like a carrot. So they'll just start on one end and munch all the way down, and it leaves you with a little needle nub at the end. So that's the two different types of damage you often see. And yes, you can have very, very large infestations. You can see a bunch of longleaf here that have been completely stripped of needles. Here's a couple of white pine, also stripped of needles. So not saying it doesn't happen. It happens. It's probably not going to kill these trees, but it is going to weaken them a little bit. Physical damage is another inciting factor, and this can happen both urban and natural areas. I like to say if there's a sloppy logger, sometimes you'll get a lot of, rubbing damage on the edge of these trees that are left from the machinery. But this also happens from some of the weather and from some of our storms, right? Ice storms are fairly common across a lot of the southeast. In the pine, there's a good bit of research that shows a lot of the younger pines will, they may be bent over, but a lot of them will snap back, and they will sort of eventually bend their way back, and they'll be okay. And there's also, larger storms, hurricanes and tornadoes. Each of these does a little bit of different type of damage. With hurricanes, often, stuff right in the middle of that storm path, that's going to be toast. It's going to completely snap off. But then it sort of changes gradually as you get out. You're going to have varying levels of damage kind of on the edge of the eye there, and then stuff kind of on the outside will make it. So there is some issue with the stuff on the edge, right? Because that stuff can get whipped around, and even though it may have stood and survived, there's only so much bending back and forth the tree can take without sustaining that internal damage, and those secondary insects will sniff that out easy. Tornadoes a little more straightforward. There's usually a fairly clean-cut path where trees are either snapped or they are not. So all this sort of depends. And then there's other more rare weather things. This is a stand of longleaf we looked at a few years ago up near Darlington, South Carolina, and nearly every single one of these early shooting stage had multiple stems, and the only thing we could figure was that an early frost, I believe the previous year, somewhat killed that terminal leader, and it made them shoot up a whole bunch of extras. Now, again, this isn't killing the tree, but it's probably not good for it. And there are some fungi that act as inciting factors too. Pitch canker is one of those. This is named for that large amount of resin at the canker site. You do see it fairly often in seed orchards, but then I see it kind of everywhere as well, and there are occasional outbreaks of it. I put that it's associated with this Deodar weevil. We'll talk a little more about that later, but not necessarily purposely carried. This beetle's associated with it because it gets attracted to those sappy flowing areas and just sort of gets dirty feet and carries it to the next tree. But what you primarily see are these dead needles and very heavy resin flow on the terminal leader. One thing to notice is when you have a lot of this fungal damage, I tend to see, here's Dave's opinion, right? If there's fungal damage on the tip, you're going to see the needles droop down. They always, to me, tend to droop down. On the other hand, with ipsbark beetles, which we'll talk about in a little bit, when they kill a branch or a terminal, the needles tend to stay out. They still turn brown, but they stay out. So that's my 55-mile-an-hour diagnosis. If you're driving and you see a bunch of terminals where the needles are all droopy, it's probably a fungus. If the needles are still out, it's likely an ips. Chief hosts are, slash shortleaf Virginia longleaf pine. Again, here's a longleaf that has a dead terminal because of that. If you get in there and really pick it apart, you'll see a lot of resin soaking on that terminal leader. Heavy pitch flow. Give you an example here. A few years ago, we had to deal with some folks. There's a seed orchard down in Florida. They had a little pitch canker episode, I call it. Trees were, mature. About halfway up the tree was pretty good damage, 100 or 20% infected. And when we went to look at them, this is what we saw. You see so much sap. It looks like these things are just big candles, right? There's just sap dripping all over the tree, all the way down to the ground. Unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do when stems are infected. Sometimes these trees will survive quite a while. Other times they might die fairly quickly. Sanitation is really your only control measure there. As we said earlier, most of the insects and diseases of pines are contributing, right? They're not going to be primary. The big exception is southern pine beetles. So real quick, bark beetles, most of the ones we have here with the exception of the southern pine beetle. They're going to attack stressed trees, right? Ips are the type that attacks a stressed tree. They feed on phloem, that is that green tissue underneath the bark, the sleeve of life, if you will. Girdling consumes the phloem, and then trees die from lack of nutrition. And here's your main culprits. You've got ips along the left side there. The two big ones are your turpentine beetles, your black turpentine beetle, your red turpentine beetle, and then your southern pine beetle right here. So we'll talk about this one first. This is all life size, as you know, next to a dime. So none of these are very big, but let's talk about SPB, because that is the #1 pine pest in the eastern part of the country. This is that picture I showed you earlier, Dendroctonus frontalis. The anatomy of this southern pine beetle spot, if you look way in the middle, you see a little circle of green. So it looks like a big donut, and there's a circle of green. That is the oldest part of the spot, so old, in fact, that other things have grown up in there, probably hardwoods. And then as you go out from that circle, you see gray trees. These are completely dead and needleless. You see red trees, which are completely dead, but still holding those red needles. You see yellow trees. They are in the process of dying. And then you see the just very early faders on the outside edge. Most of the time, when they are not in outbreak phase, they're admittedly tough to find. They'll attack some, lightning struck trees, that type of thing. The populations do go up and down. We know this. Some evidence that the outbreaks coincide with drought, but more often I think we see that these coincide with poor basal area management. Now, how do you know if you have southern pine beetle? It's incredibly important to know what pest you have, because that is going to dictate how you treat these things. One of the main keys for me in an active SPB infestation is green needles drop into the ground. This is the only pine bark beetle that I have seen, that I know of, where green needles will drop to the ground. Oftentimes, this is when the trees still appear green. So these trees might appear green as you look up, but if you look on them, you're probably going to see pitch tubes everywhere. These trees are more or less walking dead. They just don't know they're dead yet, but the message is getting there, right? And then those beetles will attack SPB tubes in the crack plate. So cracks down, they won't be on the flat part, right in the crack. The tree tries to defend itself by putting out pitch, but if as a female gets in there, she'll get in there, and then she'll start to make a gallery. There's a generally S-shaped gallery. So you can see you got the female crawling here towards the top of that slide, and she has made an actual S-shaped gallery. So S for southern pine beetle. And then you can see as the infestation goes on, you get more and more galleries all over the place. Larvae tend to stay in these galleries, and they eat on one end and poop on the other. So you get these frass-packed galleries. You'll often see those on the inside of the bark. Blue stain fungi gets introduced as well, and then on the way out of the tree, the beetle makes these tiny circular exit holes, right? And you'll notice there's no pitch around the exit holes, because the battle has already been lost, right? The tree puts out that pitch early on, trying to keep that beetle out of there. They are successful in some cases, but then in other cases, once that beetle gets in there, the tree, there's not much they can do. So management for southern pine beetle has gotten a lot of attention, so we know well what to do. There's a very good trapping system that happens in most of the southeastern states. Those traps are probably out. I know they're out right now, and they look at the ratio of predator beetles to southern pine beetles, and they can sort of get a picture, get an idea of where we can expect high SPB populations. This is one of the more important things, in my opinion, that those state forestry agencies and state forest health folks do, is do this SPB trapping. If you do get an SPB infestation, the way to go about that is to cut around the infestation, cut a buffer area around there. So what we do is we go to the edge, on the edge of that infestation, find the tree at the edge that is at the very outer edge. So let's say your outer tree is 50 feet tall. You want to cut a buffer that's 1.5 times that height. So if you have a 50-foot tall tree on the edge that's infested, a 75-foot buffer of live trees is what you can cut around the whole infestation, and that generally stops the infestation. These infestations are spread and sort of move on their own by chemical cues the beetles put out. If there's a big buffer there, it basically creates a wind tunnel. And so as those beetles put out those pheromones, the wind picks it up, takes it away, and then you don't have that infestation continuing. In other areas, you may be able to get some salvage. Some of these trees you might be able to sell and salvage those. We also, Central America also has SPBs to get some debarking. Sometimes we don't really do that here in the States. And then again, these predator beetles, these clarid beetles, you actually see one here with an SPB in its little mandibles right there. They're the most important predator of SPB we have. But frankly, just thin the forest, right? Thin your pines and keep them, around that 80 basal area, feet per acre. We often call stuff, we in the biz call it, if you have over 120 feet per acre basal area, you've got beetle bait, right? And the higher you go above that, the more at risk you are. So we want to keep it, below 80 if possible. 80 to 120, you're kind of getting in the danger zone there. Here's just an example. There's lots of research out there. I think one of the papers I put in that supplemental information was by John Nowak and some of us. We looked at the impact of thinning on southern pine beetle infestations. It's very clear, right? We looked at 910 spots over in Mississippi on a couple of national forests. 906 of them, I think, were in unthinned stands, and the rest were in thin stands. Here's a site where you've got thinning in 2011, and then southern pine beetle went across this whole thing in 2012. And here's where the southern pine beetle spot was. It just lined it out. It hit that same outline where it was thin versus not thin. So the thinned area is where the beetle stopped. It's very good evidence. And if you want more about the southern pine beetle complex and what we do, I encourage you to look at this webinar from last May. Dr. John Nowak runs a southern pine beetle prevention program for the southeastern US, and I would encourage you to check that out. So now we have Ips bark beetles. Ips calligraphus, granicollis, and avulsus are common through most, I would say all of the southeastern US. You're really just going to see Ips pini in more of the upper mountainy type areas, North Georgia, the mountains, that type of area. Functionally, they're all pretty much the same. They're secondary pests, right? So they're not going to be a primary tree killer. They're going to weaken or stress trees. In this case, the male starts the gallery and then brings in the female using these airborne odors or pheromones. This is what usually causes mortality during droughts. When we have droughty areas, Ips they always tend to pop up at that point, and that's often where you get a few trees or even a lot of trees dying during drought times. It's from these Ips bark beetles. Now, when there's not a drought, Ips are just kind of predators picking off the old and the weak. And even within a tree, there can be old and weak stuff, right? A little flag branch here and there, that's probably full of Ips avulsus. A branch here that broke off in a storm, this was full of all sorts of different Ips. This is one that was on the Warnell experimental forest, and all those other splash pines standing there were completely perfectly healthy. It was just this one branch that broke off that got completely hammered by Ips. So these, again, Ips, those are going to occur on the stressed and injured trees. This stress can be caused by practically anything, and I'm talking about storms, wind, lightning, fire, mechanical, drought, all of the stuff we've already talked about. If it can stress a tree, it can increase that tree's susceptibility to Ips bark beetles. And Ips only hit pine trees, right? We're talking pines today. You can also have that increased stress by vegetative competition, right? If there's a lot of ground cover growing there in woody competition, that tree's fighting for water, not winning, that basically puts it in a drought situation. And then some of those pathogens as well. We see this with the anosum root rot quite a bit, in that the root rot tends to weaken that tree. And then those Ips, you'll see those up top. I really think a lot of what gets blamed as Ips damage is probably anosum as well. Unlike southern pine beetle, where you've got a concentrated spot that spreads as the infestation spreads, Ips bark beetles, again, pick off a tree here and a tree there. And you can see in this slide, you've just got a sort of a sprinkling of brown brownish trees in there. Those were the weak ones that the Ips picked off. Why they chose those, you'd have to look more carefully, but for some reason, those trees were weaker than their neighbors, and they got weak enough to a point where they were susceptible to Ips. And then we have turpentine beetles, the red turpentine beetle, which is Dendroctonus terebrans, and that's the black turpentine beetle. The red turpentine beetle is Devalens. red turpentine beetle, like Ips pini, you generally only find that up in the mountains, but the black turpentine beetle is present, throughout the southern pine range. These beetles, again, are fairly large. Whenever you look here, they're twice as big as most of these other things. And they make pitch tubes that are twice as big as a lot of these other things. And these are generally found the bottom 10 feet or so of the tree. The pitch tubes can stick out an inch. They can be, the size of a, diameter of a quarter or $half even sometimes. They get really large. We see these a lot where there's physical damage, where there's a hot fire, where there's a canker. We see these oftentimes forming right there. And one thing that these beetles tend to make is what I call pitch BBs. If you look on the right, you see kind of on the bottom there by that axe blade, what looks like little tiny BBs made of pitch. And this is because those beetles are so large and strong. As that tree, they're digging into that tree, they're chewing in, the tree's oozing out sap, they're basically swimming through there, and they're rolling these little pitch balls that sort of dry off and fall down to the bottom. You don't see these with southern pine beetle. You don't see these with Ips bark beetles. And we talk, I always talk about a healthy tree resists a lot of these things, right? A healthy tree is going to resist almost all of this stuff. And so here's an example. Here's a tree that was a healthy 13-year-old loblolly pine in Aiken County, South Carolina, right down there by Augusta. And it was healthy, perfectly healthy, but what I did was I nailed a whole bunch of artificial baits to it, so it smelled like, to the bugs, there's all sorts of beetles in there. And so this called all these beetles in, so I wanted to see kind of what was happening. So one of the first beetles that gets there encounters a ton of resistance through the pitch. And you can see, here's one of the pitch tubes, or the pitch tubes from one of the early beetles. It's huge. And you see there's not even a hole there because there was an entombed beetle inside that pitch, because this tree was so healthy, it was able to fight this thing off and it won that little battle. But as more and more beetles come and keep chewing in there, this is a beetle pitch tube from probably somewhere in the middle. You can notice there's actually a little hole there, and it's a much smaller pitch tube, right? So the tree fought what it could, but the beetle eventually got in. And then by the end, that tree just doesn't have anything left, right? And the beetle had a fairly easy way into that tree to establish its brood. So the healthier the tree, the better chance it has of fending off a lot of these secondary beetles. Another secondary beetle that we see fairly commonly is the pine sawyer beetles. These are Monochamus species. There's a couple of species throughout the southeast. They're really hard to tell apart morphologically, so we just call them Monochamus pine sawyers. They're fairly large. These antennae can be several inches across. They make these little conical divots inside the tree. And what's happening is you've got an adult beetle is chewing that divot, and then she turns around and lays an egg in there. We call that an egg niche. And here you can actually see, so these are extremely weak secondary things. They're not coming to a tree that's healthy. They're one of the last things in the party, right? If you've got Monochamus, that tree is completely toast. And here you can see an egg niche next to an Ips pitch tube, right? So there's a pitch tube, there's a Monochamus egg niche. You often see these things together because they're both weak secondary insects. And one interesting thing about the Ips pitch tubes compared to the SPB, they're similar in size. Ips pitch tubes tend to get put right on the flat plate of that bark. So you can see right here, it's on the very flat part. The SPB pitch tube would be kind of down the crack in between those plates. Anyway, the sawyer beetles, these are those huge larvae that if you're out there and you're lucky enough to hear that crunch, 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 crunching next to a pine tree that's dying, that's these larvae chewing through that what's left of the phloem and wood. So they're in there gnawing away. In some cases, again, you can hear the crunch, crunch, crunching from outside that tree. And then here we are again, we're at that Pissodes nemorensis, the Deodar weevil. Yes, they can spread the pitch canker a little bit, but also they make these little chip cocoons. So this is another weak secondary thing. Sometimes you see it, trees that are dying or dead, you'll pull off the bark and there'll be all these little, almost capsule-like sawdust things on the outside of that, on the inside of that bark on the wood, and that's all these little pupal chambers for this thing. Again, secondary thing, if your tree has these, your tree is done, basically. And there's also ambrosia beetles. These are things, there are many different kinds of these, most of them southeastern native, but there's quite a few non-native ones as well in terms of pine trees. These will attack stress trees anywhere. And I'm talking about natural areas, nurseries, someone's yard, side of the road, 1,000-acre stand. It doesn't matter. If there's a stress tree, you can get ambrosia beetles, and they often come even after some of the ips and the Monochamus. Ambrosia beetles do not eat the tree per se, right? All they're doing is digging in there, trying to create a gallery, create a home to rear their larvae. So they just chew in. They've got either on their mouth or their elytra, they carry these fungal spores, and they inoculate these fungal spores, and the larvae feed on that fungus. And the most common one we have in pine is this platypus species. It's kind of a long thing with a couple of points on the bottom or on the back end of it. It tends to put those really, really fine sawdusts at the base of the tree. So if you see really, really fine sawdust, it's probably ambrosia beetles. Now, let's talk about these Hylastes species root-feeding beetles. There's 3 native and 1 non-native in the southeast. These colonize weak and dying pines. I've highlighted that because they have been implicated in pine decline. And you know, this was a big thing in the southeast a few years ago. Like, oh my gosh, there's these root-feeding beetles everywhere there's pine decline. These things, by nature, go to trees that are dead and dying and recycle them. So if you go to a tree that's dead and dying and you find these particular beetles, well, no crap, right? That's what they're there for. That is the whole point. Decline is a tricky thing. A decline is a whole syndrome of several different things that work together. That just means there's a progression of things that have weakened that tree. It's not some mystery. It just means a bunch of stuff weakened the tree. There really is no pine decline, to be honest. If you have these beetles at your tree, it means your tree is dying from something else. Happy to take questions on that, but we're going to keep going for now. So fusiform rust is another one of these things we see fairly often, right? This is one of the worst forest diseases we have in the southeast. You get the cankers. It's getting to the season where we're getting that bright orange Cheeto dust everywhere. It has a very complicated life cycle, but honestly, the most important stuff is it goes between oak and pine host. So if you've got both of those things, you've got better odds of having that stuff. And here's what we're seeing. You get these cankers that result in, you know, multiple branching. Right about now, you're getting sporulations. So you get that bright orange Cheeto dust everywhere on those things. Breakage at cankers is super common, so you see that fairly often. Now, how do you manage fusiform rust? In nurseries, there's chemical treatments. In older stands, you can delay fertilizing because those spores would get started on areas that are growing very rapidly and break a little bit. Breeding resistance is honestly the way to go. This has been kind of one of our success stories, is breeding that fusiform rust resistance. And to be honest, I think there's a little bit of luck involved in it. I've seen such heterogeneity in where fusiform rust is and isn't. It doesn't often make sense to me. Some places have it, some don't. It's probably tied to the genetics of that stand itself. Anosum is another one. Depending upon how long in the tooth you are, you may call this heterobacinine, you may call it anosum, anosis, or fomes if you are particularly seasoned. Either way, probably one of the top 2 worst diseases next to fusiform. This is one that invades and degrades the root system, and the spores are spread by wind. Here's a nice schematic that was put together for us. You've got those fungal conchs at the bottom there, and those spores can be spread by wind to cut stumps. The spores can also grow through root grafts into neighboring trees. So that's 2 ways it can spread. And anosum's tricky because when you're in a spot of anosum, it just sort of looks like the pines gave up, right? It looks kind of similar to early Ips damage. You don't see the needle browning. You just see sort of a fading in a light or a weaker canopy. You get foliage loss. And the thing to look for, those pockets, especially on that old ag land. And then these trees are prone to falling over. So this is different than with Ips, where the trees stay up often. In this case, you're getting the root system degraded, so they're prone to falling over. And if you start digging down there, you'll see, you know, roots that are completely, you know, resin filled. It might even stick to some of that sandier soil. Eventually, it turns into more of a white rot, and then you get that root degradation where the tree will just fall over. The risk factors are all related to soil type, right? Sandy loam soils are the most With the highest risk, down to that clay stuff is not as big a risk. And this is this varies a lot across the southeastern region, right? Here's your high, medium, low hazard map. On a broad scale, you can even look at a single plot and you'll see high, medium, and low just within a single stand, right? So it really depends on where you are. To manage it, you can do a clear cut if you've got a stand that's got a lot of anosum and it's spreading, instead of having it spread from stump to stump, you can clear cut and that will halt it because there'll be nowhere else for it to go. There are several stump treatments you can put on there, and then also if you thin it during the summer months in hotter areas, that works pretty well. We say below this 34-degree line, if you thin in the summer, it's going to be hot enough down there to where the top of that stump is going to get so warm that even if a spore landed on the top of that stump, it's probably going to cook and fry and not be able to grow in there. And then there's a few other more minor things. Brown spot needle blight is something we see quite a bit, primarily in longleaf. This is one of those that can delay the growth, probably isn't going to kill that tree. Brown spot because you've got a brown spot between, within a yellow band. What this mainly causes is it causes that premature needle abscission, so those needles fall off. Happens in the grass stage, happens as it's shooting up. You can see there's a pile of needles down there. You can manage it in several ways. There's resistant seedlings, promoting aeration, right? Because it's a fungus, it likes stuff a little more humid. So if you promote aeration, fungicides work. But honestly, if you're burning when you should be, it's going to burn off a lot of that inoculum, and you're just not going to have a problem with brown spot needle blight. And then needle cast. This has gotten a lot of attention lately because it's kind of blown up in the last few years. This is caused by several species of needle fungi, Lophidermium being one of the more common. Depending on the species, it either infects the current or last year's needles. The needle's brown from the tip in, and then they die and fall off. If you look in there, some of these fruiting bodies have particular shapes to them. So needle cast disease, the needle death again progresses from the tips inward. Current or last year needles, but it goes from the tips in. So you often get this sort of half brown, half green needle, which gives the whole tree like a dingy brownish look to it. Some of the lookalikes we often see are tip blight, and the difference here is that all the needles on a tip die all at once, right? You just get a brown tip. We also get this pine needle rust, and this starts out as these little whitish wings on the needles, right? You'll see them kind of all over. Eventually the needles will yellow and fall off. And then it's always good to remember that needles are just leaves and leaves fall off. So we get a lot of questions every year from homeowners. Why do my trees look half brown every fall? It's simply because that's the needles that are old. They are falling off. The tips of those branches, the ends of those branches are perfectly healthy. I like to tell people these needles falling off is where pine straw comes from. So this is a perfectly natural thing. So when you're looking at this stuff, it all depends on the pattern of needle browning and the pattern of needle loss. With that, we will take any questions we have. We covered a lot of stuff, but the Cliff Notes version is, when someone says, what's killing my tree? Unless it's southern pine beetle, it's probably going to be complicated. There's going to be a lot of stuff that impacts, does that tree survive and make it and all that type of thing. So a lot of stuff happening. Thanks, folks. And Molly?
Great job, Dave. That was excellent. Yes, we did get a few questions come in. And if any of these questions jog your memory or make you think of something that you would like to ask, please just go ahead and throw them in the chat box, and I can usually keep up pretty well. All right. So first question is, Dr. Coyle, did you say southern pine beetle is a pine tree pest that should be more concerning and treated for versus Ips beetles?
Yeah, I mean, Ips beetles, the management for Ips beetles is just proper management of your pine trees. Southern pine beetle is the one pest we have down here that if an outbreak starts, devastating effects. It's going to kill a bunch of trees. So management for both of these is similar, right? The whole key is keeping basal area where it needs to be, proper silviculture, keep your competition down. By doing those, if you do those things, you will probably avoid all of these beetles and all of these issues with proper management. But yeah, if you're winning one versus the other, SPB is much more important, I guess is a word to use, than Ips. Ips are they're out there, and if there's a drought, there's sometimes not a lot you can do. Now there's some evidence and research that maybe if you plant trees on a wider spacing, they'll be a little more resilient during a drought because they'll have more area to suck up some water and remain a little stronger. But honestly, basal area to me is one of the big keys here. Keep that basal area where it needs to be.
Great, great. Great question. I just want to interject. I see a lot of people are asking if this is going to be available on demand. A recording certainly will be. You can access it through the same portal that you used to get here. Click on the same orange button that'll be there. And within the next 24 to 48 hours, it'll just take you right to our YouTube portal and you can watch it there. Also, Dr. Coyle, if you don't mind just providing me with a PDF of the presentation that you gave, some people are asking for slides. Great.
Yep, happy to do it.
Thank you. Okay, do southern pine beetles affect landscape trees? And if so, what should we do to prevent infestation?
Yeah, they certainly can. And this is where, you know, as we see more of that urban sprawl and you get more people putting neighborhoods in the woods, if you're backed up to the woods and there's a southern pine beetle outbreak happening, it doesn't care if your tree is planted in rows in an acreage or if it's just in your yard. If it's in the wake of that outbreak, it will mow through that just as well. If you have a yard tree, a yard pine, and you know there's a southern pine beetle infestation near, there's some insecticides that people say can be used. I'm not particularly sold on them. Unfortunately, southern pine beetle outbreaks are hard. Unless you can cut around that thing, there's not a lot you can do. I mean, there are some bark sprays you can spray, but I mean, SPV will get practically all over the tree. So unless you can coat that entire trunk, there's not a lot you can do. I don't have a better answer or better advice than that. But that's just one of the trade-offs we have for living, kind of out in the woods, so to speak, or out in the country, is we're sort of beholden to some of these things.
Okay. How does southern pine beetle introduce fungi to the pine trees?
They carry spores on their body. There's little pockets on their elytra, and as they're tunneling through, the spores just sort of slough off into the gallery. That's also how the ambrosial beetles do it and that type of thing too. It's not something they're doing on purpose. It's just stuff rubs off as they're drilling through there. If you've ever picked apart, a bark beetle, there's not a lot of extra room in those tunnels. They're basically just squeezing through there. They're not chewing any more than they have to. So stuff just kind of rubs off.
Good. All right. What type of lure or pheromone products are used for trapping southern pine beetle?
Gosh, this is embarrassing, but I don't remember what they are because part of the thing is they're constantly tweaking them to try to improve what they use. And I would have to get back to you. I know there's a consistent lure combination they use at the state level, so I could reach out, or you could reach out. It's Brad Caudle. Depending on what state you're in, if you're down here in the southeastern U.S., reach out to your state forestry commission, forest health person. If you want to reach out to me, I can get you in touch with the right person. They can tell you exactly what they're using.
Terrific. That kind of covers that next question. Okay. What are the chances of southern pine beetle getting into the northeastern region?
They're already in the northeastern region. We had a pretty big outbreak just a few years ago, all the way up into New York, got hit hard, New Jersey. I think they were in Massachusetts. So they're already up there, Part of this is climate change. As it gets warmer, they're able to incrementally kind of go up there. And, another part of it is management. They don't, southern pine is such a big part of our forestry ecology and economy in the southeast U.S. It's managed. We know what to do with it. There's a healthy wood market for it. When you get up into the New Jersey pine barrens in New York, they've got some different pines, pitch and that type of thing. It's just very different up there. There's a lot more older stuff. There's a lot more unthinned stuff that's just sort of natural areas, and they don't have the markets like we do. And it's just not as big a commercial machine, if you will. So yeah, SPB has wreaked a lot of havoc up there already. It's sort of died off now. I mean, the general pulse of it has sort of regressed a little bit now, but it's certainly been up there. It has been up there before, but it's been a long time since it was up there. So we are seeing it creep up there into the northeast.
Okay. Well, do you know if pine sawyer beetles spread nematode infestations?
I think they do, if I remember rightly, but that's not something I've looked at for quite a while. So
Yeah.
if whoever's asking that is super interested, you can let me know and I can look into that a little more.
Okay. So someone's wondering, are you saying that pine decline does not exist? It seems pretty real in Southwest Alabama.
I would argue that that's not pine decline. There's other factors that are going on there. So no, pine decline doesn't exist. What pine decline is a series of things that is leading to a tree getting weak enough for these beetles to go to. Using the term decline is, to me, just, it's something that scientists do when they don't know what's going on. And I just don't think that's right. Some decline, like there's all sorts of declines, right? Maple decline, ash decline, yellow cedar decline. There's declines all over the place. And in some cases, they've completely figured out what the sequence of events is, right? With the yellow cedar decline, it's climate change and there's a number of things, but they know what has happened. With pine decline, and this was high, in Alabama, especially in the like late O's, 07, 8, 9, 10, 11, kind of that range, trees were dying. Yeah, it was also super droughty, and I think it's interesting in that once it started raining again more consistently in like 12, 13, 14, all of a sudden all these reports of dying pine trees pretty much dwindled off. It's just like a miracle. So yeah, I don't think there's a thing as pine decline. I think there are cases where on certain sites, a series of events happens. It's not caused by insects. It's something abiotic or maybe biotic in the soil, but it's definitely not caused by these root feeding weevils. It's not caused by Ips beetles. Those things are responding to trees that are already weak. And the whole key to all of this thing is, if these insects are here, why are those trees weak in the first place, right?
Right.
What predisposing factors are there making those trees weak? It's not just that they magically start declining. Something is making them get weak and decline in the first place, and that is what needs to be found out. And sometimes that's really hard to do, right? Sometimes it's not an easy find, it's not an easy fix, but that is your underlying cause of the issue, is what caused those trees to be weak and susceptible to these secondary insects in the first place.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that's an important distinction. And I came up in my education learning about pine decline too. So this is all pretty new to a lot of us. So it's pretty great that Dr. Coyle's getting ahead of it in this chat. And as always, if this is confusing or new to hear, feel free to reach out to any of us and we'd be happy to talk to you more about it. I think it all comes back to that Manion spiral and secondary pests. All right, Dr. Coyle, can you talk more about leptographium fungus as a cause of pine decline and management or treatment options?
It's not a cause, it's a secondary fungus, again, that is only getting hold in a tree because that tree is already weak. So I wouldn't recommend any management. Your management is figuring out what is causing those trees to be weak in the first place and fixing that issue, right?
Yeah.
I don't know of any leptographium in the southeast that is an aggressive primary tree killer. Certainly they're there. Okay. Leptographium wagnerii is a bad one, but we don't have that one down here. To my knowledge, the leptographium and grossmania we have in this region are secondary. And when you have a secondary thing, something is making that tree weak enough for that secondary thing to infect it in the first place. So the whole key is, what is making those trees susceptible to root weevils, leptographium, Ips bark beetles? You got to figure out what's upstream of that, causing all that stuff first.
Excellent. So Dr. Coyle, we still have several questions remaining and we are coming up on the hour. Would you be free to stick around for another, 10 minutes or so?
I can, yeah, I can stay around.
Okay. Folks, if you do need to go, you are free to go ahead and take your CEU quiz. We've hit the hour mark, so that's all that we needed to hit in order for you to be eligible. So if you can't stick around, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Is there an ideal basal concentration level to target or help reduce fungus problems?
I don't know that any research that has looked at basal area as it relates to fungal issues. We tend to really focus on basal area as it relates to the bark beetle issues. So I don't know of any that specifically looked at fungal issues versus basal area.
Okay. Are you aware of disease monitoring programs by state? And do you know if there are any maps available?
Boy, that is a good question. I do not know. I don't believe they don't monitor for fusiform. They don't monitor for any of the things we talked about today. They don't have any active monitoring for them that I know of. They're just so common out there. I just don't think they have any of the active monitoring. The active monitoring for disease they do have that I can think of is more for some of the invasive hardwood stuff. The laurel wilt is one of the ones that comes to mind. There's a really active monitoring for that, but I can't think of any for pine. There's groups that are working on certain topics. I know there's a group now that's working on the needle cast issue, trying to figure out where that is and what all that is, but I don't know of anything that's available out there, state or region wide.
Okay. And for these more common issues, we do try and keep updated maps on spread on our website, so you can always go and look at the appropriate tab for those. Oh, which beetles can you hear munching in the tree?
That's the pine sawyers, the Monochamus, the great big ones. The beetles themselves are 1.5 inches long, and then the larvae are about that long. The antennae are 3-4 inches long each, so they're pretty sizable things. So those are the ones you can usually hear chewing.
It's pretty cool. In central Kentucky, southern pine beetle is strongly associated with utility clearance. Could this be minimized by limiting pruning pines after frost?
Yeah, utility pruning is like the worst possible thing that you can do to a tree, because it goes in there and it basically goes against every ISA pruning protocol, because they just saw stuff off to clear a line, right? Yeah, it's utility pruning is the worst, and there's until we can get some of those companies that prune different, I think there's just always going to be issues, and I've talked to some of them, and and I've sort of made that case, by pruning the way you do, you're causing these trees to get weak, and probably a bunch are going to die from bark beetles because these trees are like so weak and shocked. And the response was basically, well, it's still cheapest for us to do it that way, to deal with some dead ones later, than to carefully prune everything along. So they're just going to keep making their tunnel, and then just kind of have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Oh, and as far as when, the timing, I don't know if it would matter when they're pruned. It would be certainly better to prune them in the winter when the trees are dormant. Even pines go dormant in winter, but from a utility perspective, I think they just get to it when they get to it. And at that, they're just like, it's on the calendar and that's when it goes.
Yeah, that's definitely how it seems. I found anosum root rot on seedlings and varying sapling sizes. Is there anything that can be done?
Oof, for anosum, I don't know if there's a treatment for anosum. Michelle Cram with the Forest Service in Athens would know. She's the anosum expert in this region, so she would be the one that I would contact, or you can contact her directly. So Michelle Cram with U.S. Forest Service in Athens, Georgia.
Okay, after we let Dr. Coyle go, I'll get her information. I can pop that in the chat box. We're getting towards the end here, Dave. If you are going to have various pine species in an acreage, what percentage, okay, I think we kind of covered this, but what percentage in acreage of each works best to reduce these issues? So perhaps talking about proportions of different species, does that kind of thing matter?
Mixed species, so I don't, in urban areas, we sort of recommend no more than 10% of one thing, right? And this is in urban areas where you've got a more, the capability for a more diverse canopy. If you're just doing pine, part of it's going to depend on where you are. You're not going to plant shortleaf pine in the panhandle of Florida, right? You're not going to get slash up in Kentucky, something like that. So there's not as many pine species that will grow together based on where you are. So, in any case like that, the more evenly you can distribute the different species, the better. So then is going to get back down to what's your objective for that land, right? What are you trying to do there? If you're trying to, evenly distribute your species, but still want to do this from a production standpoint, you got to understand that those pines are going to mature and grow at different rates. And so, you know, some of these are going to grow a lot faster than others. So you're going to reach a point where this species is ready to go to market and these species are not. So it depends on, you know, that's a tricky question, a good one, but a tricky one, because it really depends on what's the landowner objective for that plot of land. But in general, the more evenly you can, you know, have different species, the better.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, that's everything. Thank you so much for sticking around for those that extra chunk of time. Tremendous presentation. And if anybody does have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to relay it to the appropriate people. Like I said, we will have this presentation uploaded so you can watch it on demand. I'll also make the PDF available. Thank you so much, Dr. Coyle. We really appreciate you stopping by today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
All right. Take it easy. Bye.
Bye.